all of your most basic beliefs about reality, which we call presuppositions. Presuppositions, your most basic beliefs about the universe, about how we know what we know, and so on and so forth. They are the rules of interpretation that we assume at the outset before any investigation of evidence. Before you do an experiment, a scientific experiment or otherwise, before you do anything, you already have certain beliefs about how the universe works. You already have certain presuppositions. For example, the belief that your senses are basically reliable. You take that for granted, that what you see and taste and touch and smell and so on really corresponds to the actual universe. You couldn't do an experiment on a rock if you didn't already believe that. You'd look at the rock and you'd say, well, just because I see it doesn't mean it's necessarily there. So there's no point in doing an experiment on it. You presuppose that your senses are basically reliable. That your memory is reliable is a presupposition. You believe that what you remember actually happened, right? For the most part. Now, if I asked you, how do you know that your memory is reliable? You say, oh, well, Dr. Lau, that's easy. I took a test 2 weeks ago. I did very well on it. It was a memory test. Excuse me, how do you know you took a test 2 weeks ago? See, just because you remember it doesn't mean it happened unless you already presuppose that your memory is reliable. Or laws of logic are presuppositions. The fact that the law of non-contradiction, you can't have A and not A at the same time in the same relationship. That is a presupposition. You couldn't begin to reason about things unless you already took it for granted that there are laws of logic. That's a presupposition. Now here's the key. Creationists and evolutionists have different sets of presuppositions, different worldviews, different rules for interpreting the evidence. And that's very important to understand because the battle really isn't about evidence. It's about how evidence ought to be interpreted. And we have different standards by which we interpret the evidence. Now, for the creationist, the Bible is the ultimate standard by which evidence should be interpreted. I'm not saying that all creationists do have the Bible as their ultimate standard. I'm saying they should. The Bible should be our ultimate standard in reasoning. Now, I have secondary standards as well. I do believe that my senses are basically reliable. But that's not my ultimate standard because I know my senses can be fooled. You take a beam of wood, for example, and put it in water at an angle, and it looks like the wood bends when it goes under the water because of the way the light refracts. Now, you don't believe your eyes in those circumstances, do you? You don't believe the wood actually bends just because you see it. Because you have a greater standard that solid things stay solid even underwater and under most circumstances. You have greater standards than that. And ultimately, it will come back to an ultimate standard, which I argue ought to be the Bible. The Bible should be our ultimate standard. What about the evolutionist? What is his or her ultimate standard? Well, it actually depends on which evolutionist you ask, because there's not one single evolutionary worldview, but commonly naturalism is the ultimate standard for the evolutionist. Naturalism is the belief that nature is all that there is. There's nothing beyond the natural world. If it cannot be explained by physical processes, it doesn't exist. And then there is also empiricism. That's another ultimate standard that might be used by many evolutionists. And sometimes they believe in a combination of these two, but one of them is obviously more ultimate than the other. Empiricism is the belief that all truth claims are answered by observation. If you want to know something, you go out and look. Go out and do an experiment. That's how you answer all truth claims. Of course, I believe many truth claims are answered that way, but not all of them. Let's talk about evidential arguments. And by that I mean an argument that attempts to leave worldviews out of the discussion and simply talk on the basis of individual evidences. Evidence by itself, however, will not resolve a worldview conflict. Why is that? Because your worldview tells you what to make of the evidence. You see, that's why evidence by itself is not going to resolve anything. It's not decisive. It's not that people don't have enough evidence for creation. The Bible tells us everyone has enough evidence for the Creator God. In Romans 1. Everybody knows that. The problem is they suppress the truth in unrighteousness. And God tells us there's no excuse for that. So it's not that people don't have enough evidence. Their presuppositions tell them what to make of that evidence. And I want to give you a silly example just to drill this home. There was a man who was convinced that he himself was dead. He thinks he's dead, and he's very upset about this. He doesn't like being dead. Who would? And his doctor is trying to convince him, look, fella, you're perfectly healthy. I mean, you know, you're not dead. You're walking and talking. And the guy thinks about it and he says, yeah, but you know, people can have muscle spasms even after clinical death. That could explain my ability to walk and talk. And the doctor says, but look, I have medical charts showing you're perfectly healthy. And the guy says, yeah, but you know, who knows if you're interpreting that properly, and in any case, maybe that's not even my chart. Maybe the name got swapped. And the doctor says, okay, I'm going to prove to you that you are not dead. Do dead men bleed? The guy thinks about it for a second. Well, the circulatory system would be stopped. No, dead men don't bleed. And the doctor very quickly takes a little pin, pricks the guy in the hand. Sure enough, blood comes to the surface. The doctor says, see, you're bleeding. To which the man responds, well, how about that? I guess dead men do bleed. Silly example, but it illustrates the point. Did the doctor have evidence for his position? Absolutely. The guy could walk and talk, he had medical charts, the guy could bleed. Did the man find those evidences convincing? No. Because he had a worldview, he had a presupposition that he himself was dead, and that presupposition told him how to interpret each one of those evidences. He was always able to come up with a rescuing device, and a clever person always will come up with a rescuing device. That's why you can't just throw evidence at people and expect them to change their worldview. There's no obligation for them to do so. They're just going to interpret that evidence accordingly. That's why you can't just, people don't just need more reasons to believe. That's not a logical or biblical approach to apologetics. They need to have their worldview challenged. That's what we want to do. Now, you may have very good evidence for creation. You might say, see how this is evidence that the Bible is true? And maybe it's very good evidence that confirms creation. I happen to think fossils are very good evidence that confirm the worldwide flood, don't get me wrong. But that's because I'm looking at it properly through biblical glasses. My secular colleague is going to look at that same evidence through secular glasses, and what's he going to say? He's going to say, that's not how I see it. That's not how I see it. He's going to come up with a rescuing device to account for that evidence according to his worldview. And to add insult to injury, he's going to say, actually, you're the one coming up with the rescuing devices. My explanation's the right one. And so we think, oh, well, maybe that's not a good evidence. Let's try something else then. What about canyon formation? See, canyons can form quickly. And he says, well, maybe that one did, but how do you know that the Grand Canyon formed quickly? You don't know that. Oh, well, we need another evidence then. Look how rock layers can be deposited quickly. He said, well, Mount St. Helens proved that. And he said, well, maybe those ones can form quickly, but how do you know that all of them have formed that way? Maybe some of them are slowly over billions of years. Oh, but you see, animals, they reproduce according to their kinds. That's what we'd expect. He says, well, maybe they do today, but given enough time, one kind can change to another. Oh, but DNA has information in it. It never comes about by chance. He says, well, maybe there's some unknown mechanism that produces it. Give us time, we'll find it. Oh, but there's comets out there. They don't last billions of years. Oh, but there's an Oort cloud, he says. Now, it's not wrong to show people that there's evidence that is consistent with God's word and confirms that. In fact, I think there's value in that. But evidence by itself is never decisive, because you always require a worldview to tell you what to make of that evidence. Therefore, a philosophically astute person will not be persuaded by mere evidence. And that's probably worth getting in your notes. A philosophically astute person will not be persuaded by mere evidence. Why? Because if he's clever, if he's philosophically astute, if he's sticking to his worldview, he's going to come up with a rescuing device for every evidence that you present. You see, and so he's not going to be persuaded one way or the other. Evidence by itself is not decisive because a person's presuppositions tell him what to make of the evidence. And why is it we have a difficult time with this? Well, I think part of it is we tend to spend a lot of time with people that have the same worldview that we do. And therefore they are inclined to interpret the evidence the same way. And so we can change their mind on something by presenting new evidence. If you and I had a disagreement about whether or not there are crackers in the pantry, we can settle that disagreement by going over to the pantry, opening it up, and see if there are crackers there. And we should be brought to the same position based on this evidence because we have the same worldview. We already agree on the rules of interpretation. And so, yeah, you see the crackers, there they are, I was right. And so our beliefs are brought into alignment. But if I'm having that same discussion with a Hindu who believes that this universe is illusion, because Hindus have a monistic worldview, they think this world is all illusion, and I show him the crackers, he's going to be convinced? No, he's going to say that's an illusion too, because he's got a different worldview. You see, evidence is not decisive when it's a worldview discussion. And origins, guess what, is a worldview discussion. And so we need to keep that in mind. And the problem with many creationists today, and virtually all evolutionists, is that they argue as if their opponent had the same worldview they do. And they get very frustrated because they say, why don't you understand that this evidence proves my point? Well, we need to think in terms of worldviews. We cannot argue that our worldview is right because of the evidence, because our worldview tells us how to interpret that evidence. And I hope that that is clear. Somehow we need to show that our standard is the correct standard. How are we going to get anywhere then? I'm over here standing over on my biblical presuppositions. My secular friend is standing on his secular presuppositions. How are we going to get anywhere in this debate? Let me give you the wrong answer before I give you the right answer, because good teachers always do that, right? They give you the wrong answer first. Well, the wrong answer is this, and a lot of times evolutionists will say, well, let's meet here on neutral ground. He says maybe there are some presuppositions we can agree upon, and maybe those, we can abandon the other ones. And one of the ones you have to abandon is that the Bible's the Word of God, he says, because I certainly don't believe that. So leave the Bible out of the discussion. We both agree science is useful, so let's just talk in terms of science on neutral ground. Now, what's the problem with neutral ground? There is no neutral ground, right? Jesus says, he who is not with me is against me. He who does not gather with me scatters. Romans 8:7, the mind set on the flesh is hostile toward God. Does that sound neutral to you? Hostile toward God, for it does not subject itself to the law of God, is not even able to do so. Do you not know that friendship with the world is hostile?